Welcome to From Vienna to Movies, Costume Designer Ruth Morley at 100, a birthday commemoration. A conversation with her daughter Melissa Hacker and Susan Gammie, her assistant, protégé, and close friend. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. I'm honored to introduce Melissa Hacker, who's the daughter of Ruth Morley and the executive director of the Kindertransport Association. Melissa is a filmmaker who made her directing debut with the documentary My Knees Were Jumping, Remembering the Kindertransports, which was shortlisted for Academy Award nomination and shown worldwide. Honors received for Ex Libris, Live in Book Plates. Melissa's current work in progress include a Fulbright Artist in Residence Award in Vienna and residencies at Yaddo, VCCA, Playa, Villa Par Bay AIR, Saltonstall, Millay, and the LABA Laboratory for Jewish Culture. Melissa has spoken internationally on the Kindertransports, consulted on exhibits including Rescuing Children on the Brink of War, created at the Center for Jewish History in New York, which opened at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum in September 2025, and Without a Home, Kindertransports from Vienna at the Vienna Jewish Museum. Melissa is the editor of 2 Academy Award-nominated documentary films, A Wandering Professor, most recently in Yangon, Myanmar, and serves on the governing board of the World Federation of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants. We'll start the event with Melissa speaking about her mother, and then we'll continue with Susan Gammie speaking, who is very grateful for Ruth's influence in her life, first as her assistant and then as her protégé and close friend. She was Ruth's assistant for 5 years, working in both film and theater, on films including Tootsie and The Money Pit, and the Broadway production of Death of a Salesman, starring Dustin Hoffman, that was later adapted for film. Her years at Ruth's assistant left her well prepared for her own work in independent film, as costume designer on My Little Girl, Gathering of Old Men, Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, Marriage, and Lee Grant's Hard Promises. Her career took an unexpected turn when ABC Television sought to modernize the production values on its long-running soap opera, One Life to Live, and Susan was hired to create a more character-driven look for the show. Susan stayed at One Life for 21 years and designed over 5,000 episodes, receiving 10 Emmy nominations and 3 Emmy Awards along the way. A lifelong political and community activist, Susan's career took one more turn when, in 2015, she became the head of the film and television department at United Scenic Artists, IATSE Local USA 829. She retired from her job at the union in 2022, but still serves at the local in an elected capacity as an Eastern Region Board member rep. She also has served for 10 years on Manhattan Community Board 2, where she's vice chair of its Landmarks and Public Aesthetics Committee. After our conversation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Melissa and Susan. And now we're starting with Melissa.
Thank you, Rachel. It's really meaningful to me that we're doing this today on November 19th, 2025, on what would have been Ruth's 100th birthday. So it's really an honor and a delight to be here. And I thank you, Rachel, and the Fritz Astor Society for hosting, and Susan Gammie for joining, who it's funny for me to say Susan Gammie rather than just Susan, because I've known Susan for so many, many years, which is really a beautiful thing. So I'm going to first show and talk about a few photos of my mother's childhood in Vienna. And we're going to have a moment of patience while I do the sharing thing and narrate the sharing thing as I do it and go to slideshow so that you can actually see the slides. So my mother was born in a leafy, nearly suburban neighborhood in Vienna and had a very secure childhood. This is her first day of school. And this is her with her parents, her mother and father in their apartment. They grew up in an apartment. And this is them on a vacation. They were Viennese. And this is what they did on vacation. I'm going to stop this share now because I can't see my notes. So give me just a moment. And I'm very much abbreviating history here, but from my mother's point of view, when she was 12, her life suddenly changed. Hitler marched into Vienna in March 1938, and Austria was annexed and became part of Germany. It was no longer Vienna, Austria, but Vienna, Germany. And all of the anti-Semitic laws that had developed in Germany over 5 years immediately were applied in Austria. My mother was thrown out of school, and her father's business was seized. My grandfather walked from embassy to embassy, applying for permission to immigrate to England, Ireland, Venezuela, Shanghai, anywhere out of reach of the Nazis. He carried a note written in English. I don't know who wrote that note for him, but I've seen that note explaining that he had been a pharmacist until his business was taken away and that he had a 12-year-old daughter at home who could no longer go to school. He tried to leave Vienna as a family, but they were not able to. Even though, as my grandfather had recorded in his diary, he had affidavits from his sister in New York saying that people, not her, she had very little money, but she had gotten help from her employer at the Staatsherald, which was a German language newspaper, and she was a secretary there. And she had found people who said they would support her relatives. And the reason why that didn't help was because my mother and her mother were born in Vienna and were on the Austrian quota to the US. And my mother's father was born in the Bukovina, which was then after World War I. Before World War I, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After World War I, it was Poland. It's now Ukraine, where he was born. And he was on the Polish quota to the US. His quota number was not coming up, and my grandmother would not leave without him. I bring up the subject of quotas and numbers as many people think that Jews did not leave Germany before the war started because Nazi policies did not allow them to leave. However, in the months and years before the war started, the Nazi government wanted Jewish families to leave Germany. They would need to leave nearly everything behind, property, savings, belongings, in some cases family, but they could leave if they could get all of the right papers signed. But very few countries would let them in. The United States and other countries had small quotas. The US kept their quotas unfilled, and they did not want to take in penniless Jewish refugees. There was a refugee crisis. People were not safe in their home countries, and very few safer countries would let them in. The Kindertransports were one small exception to this rule. After the pogrom of November 9 through 10, 1938, Jews, Quakers, and Christians working together created a plan to help Jewish children trapped in Germany without a future. To quote Frau Franzi Dannenberg, a social worker in Vienna, "We didn't need to announce that we were putting together a children's transport. The information ran like wildfire through the Viennese Jewish families, and naturally, each one wanted to get their children out of Austria, away from this ghetto." When my grandparents put their daughter, who had never before crossed a street alone, on a train carrying refugee children to England, she did not know that she was one of thousands of children saved by the Kindertransports. And my grandparents did later get out. Their lives were saved through a program where Britain allowed people, refugees, Jewish refugees, who had my grandfather's number finally came up and they could go to the US, but they had no ship's passage. So Britain allowed them to come to Britain to wait until they got their ship's passage straightened out, which saved their lives because they left Vienna just a month before the war started and waited in Britain for over a year until they did get out with my mother, and they all came to New York during the war, when my mother was a teenager. And growing up in New York, I didn't know any of this. I knew that my mother was different from other mothers, that she had an accent, that we ate food that was different from other families, and that she had many fears and anxieties. There was a family photo album filled with photographs of relatives I had never met or even heard about, and I knew I was not allowed to ask questions. My mother did not want us to learn German, so it wasn't until I was an adult that I was able to translate the words scrawled by my grandfather in red crayon over a page in the photo album, which was my brother murdered in Auschwitz. In the United States, Kindertransport history was unknown for many years, and it is still far too little known. So for the Kindertransport survivors to speak of it, it would require much explanation of their pain and sorrow. And how could they bring that up in their families? What could they tell their children who they wanted to become safe American children? It's only in recent years that conversations are opening up and that research is being done. And most of the Kindertransport children never saw their parents again. My mother, in addition to many of her uncles, also her cousin, Pauli, was murdered in Auschwitz when he was 5. I knew my mother was a complicated woman, both strong and strangely fragile, with a difficult relationship with her family and her past. And also that she had forged a successful career in an exciting world. We toyed with calling this From Vienna to Hollywood, but we had to point out that she didn't actually work in Hollywood. She worked in New York most of the time because in the 70s, there was a big film industry in New York. And she only went to work in Hollywood or Los Angeles when my sister and I were teenagers, and she felt she could leave, and leave us alone. Not alone. There were people staying with us of varying caliber. But it was only later that she felt she could work in Hollywood. And she did do some work on the famous studio lots. I remember one where she was working and suddenly I was visiting, and she pointed way down one of those long roadways in the lots and said, "Look, that's Edith Head," who was a very famous costume designer who traveled around. I think it was on a golf cart or some other little conveyance that she tooled around. But also, I knew that that my mother fell in love with film in England, and that when she arrived in New York as a teenager, she helped to support her parents by drawing greeting cards and cell animation. And then she went to Cooper Union, and she had to drop out after a year, even though tuition was free. She needed to continue supporting herself and her parents. And she studied painting, and she modeled in painting classes. And eventually, and maybe Susan can talk more about it, how she got into costume design. The apocryphal story, which I don't know any truth of, is that she wanted to be a set designer, but the union test for costume design was less expensive than the one for set design. So she took that. Yeah. She also had a mentor, Rose Bogdanoff, who she worked with in the early years. One of my earliest memories is walking out of a garage in New Haven, holding a toy that had sort of a scroll of images. It was like a toy television. And what we were doing was I was going with her as she worked on a play, as Broadway shows often did previews out of town. So what I'm going to do now is go back and show just a few work photos. And then I'm going to show a short video that she did for HBO News, just to bring her into the room. And then I'll turn it over to Susan. So first, this is just again showing how it was a stable, happy family. And I can assure you, these were not costumes that they wore every day. These were vacation costumes, but traditional Austrian wear that they wanted to be photographed in on their vacation. So this is the miracle worker, and Ruth is on, looking at the photo, she's on the right. And I believe this is the film. It looks like the backdrop of a film set. But she first did the play and then she did the film, for which she was nominated for an Academy Award in black and white costume design, because it was the early days of color, so they still had two categories in the Oscars. This is from The Hustler. This is, on the left, is a sketch that she did. She did watercolor sketches, and you can see there's a swatch of fabric attached to it, which is showing what fabric would be used for this suit. And then you have George C. Scott, I believe, wearing said suit. This is Ruth and Dustin Hoffman as Dorothy when they were working on Tootsie. So, and then this is another event that we're doing in commemoration of her 100th year. Costume as character, celebrating the legacy of Ruth Morley. And Susan and I will be back, joined by Deborah Nadelman Landis, who is a costume designer and costume design historian in Los Angeles, and Julie Solomon, a brilliant author. And this will be in person in New York at the Center for Jewish History, and hosted by the American Jewish Historical Society. And it will also then be recorded and available for view. But the website is live, and you can make far in advance reservations, or just save the date for March 12th at 7 p.m. All right, I turn it over to Rachel and Susan now. But Rachel, you are muted.
Good point. Thank you, Melissa. So thank you for sharing this really amazing historic footage, and welcome, Susan Gammie. When did you meet Ruth? When did you meet Ruth? And yeah, how did you decide on a career path for yourself?
Well, before I even answer that question, I just want to thank you, Rachel, for hosting this event and echo what Melissa said about what a beautiful and meaningful thing it is to be actually having this conversation on what would have been her 100th birthday, which just, resonates so deeply. So thank you very much. Yeah, to answer your question, I mean, I was already on the costume design path when I met Ruth, who had been in Los Angeles working on some amazing movies for Francis Ford Coppola and other names people might have heard of. And, she was already a legend. I was in my late 20s. Ruth was a legend. And through a mutual wardrobe supervisor. We mutually knew, a wardrobe supervisor we mutually knew. Ruth had reached out to her because she was coming back to New York. She hadn't worked in New York in a few years, and she was looking for an assistant. So this person, this lovely wardrobe person, Arlene Coffey, said, well, you might want to talk to, you might want to talk to Susan Gammie, blah, blah, blah. I just worked with her on a movie, blah, 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 blah. So that's how we met. And I remember very vividly my interview with her on a Sunday morning in her incredible apartment on the Upper West Side, which had the feeling of a real a very European environment, and made me feel very comfortable because in many ways it reminded me of my own grandmother's. Not that they were all the same age, but just the kind of quality, the warm, rich quality of the physical environment already made me feel happy to be there. And as kind of intimidated as I was, I just answered whatever questions she had for me in a very forthright way. And, the rest is history. And it was amazing for me, you get what you need when you need it department, to have had the gift of working with Ruth for 5 years through in all different kinds of situations, from big, huge movies, little independent movies, Broadway shows, off-Broadway shows. I mean, cabaret acts. I mean, she never stopped working. She was a dynamo. And, I would like for a moment to speak about the importance, if it's all right with you, Rachel, the importance of her work in sort of the evolution of the art of costume design, particularly in film, where I think, if you think about movies from the 20s, 30s, 40s, even into the 50s, you think of a very stylized kind of look. What the clothes looked like. They were representational. They weren't organically so much involved in the performance of the actor. They weren't necessarily telling the fine points of the dramatic narrative of the story. There was a sort of overt theatricality about in movie costumes. And I think we're, among all her other incredible gifts and talents, was that because of her own unique pathway, starting in the theater and really loving the theater, Ruth did not work in that way. And she worked in a really organic, character-driven, meticulous way that really, I think, changed the bar. I mean, I don't necessarily want to say raised the bar, but it certainly moved the bar in terms of what a costume can do in a movie. And I think in terms of the power of a costume to reveal a character, to tell the dramatic story, and to really quietly but effectively and powerfully support the whole experience. I just think Ruth had a major part to play in that movement. And if you think about, the work that you've seen even in these clips and any of the movies that anybody may have seen, I think it's really evident. I mean, I think, I like to think of her as, the first method costume designer. We know what method actors are. Well, I think Ruth was a method designer. And, she was so careful and particular in her work and got so deeply involved in in the storytelling aspect. So in that degree, you might say, oh yeah, it's obvious, visual storytelling is what costume designers do. It wasn't so much that when she first started doing it. I mean, I think she really helped blaze that trail by the very nature of the depth and care. Not that other people were negligent, but the type of care that she applied to her work, where everything was very individual and her relationships with actors were deep and important and collaborative in the best sense. I mean, where she was on a mutual path of discovery with actors where she would help them find the character and they would, there was this resonance in that relationship, which I think, you know, was incredible. And this is why actors so like Dustin Hoffman or, Vanessa Redgrave or Katharine Hepburn or, or any actor, you know, really respected her. So many had such a deep respect for her because she respected them and what they were doing. And together, everybody was, you know, really working very collaboratively and in an exciting and joyful way together. So, I think these are really important things to think about when considering her work.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think, why isn't she known better? Her name and her contribution. I mean, she became part of the Hall of Fame, right? The which Hall of Fame? Like the design or Melissa, maybe you can.
I think
She's
it's
been, sorry, go on, Melissa.
Costume Designers Guild Hall of Fame, something like that. She got an award there, posthumously, of course. I mean, any recognition, which is really, I mean, it's good, but it's also tragic because she never really felt that she was like known or successful in a way. I mean, she loved doing what she was doing, and that was a big reward for her. But she was often really surprised when someone knew who she was, which is in a way is a wonderful quality, like not someone who thinks too much of themselves, but also it was to her detriment that she didn't feel a security in her work and in her status. And I think, some of that is clearly from her childhood, that the world was safe and secure, and then suddenly it wasn't. And, that she chose then to work in a freelance business is kind of wacky because that only leads to that instability being further. And, I grew up, she would never take a vacation because, there were not cell phones then. So we had this ridiculous answering service, like our number got forwarded to real people who would answer and sometimes not send on messages properly or whatever. But she would never take a vacation because she thought she would miss a job call or maybe she would never work again. So she couldn't take a vacation. So yeah, but that's a sort of sideline to why isn't her work more widely known, which I think is in part it's with costume designers. There are very few whose names are known, but then Susan can talk more about that because I just make things up when it comes to real costume design questions.
No, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think that's a great question. And I think, Rachel, and I think there's, two answers to that question, both of which Melissa has just touched on. I think one is the nature of the job itself. I think particularly as Ruth was coming up through the industry, there wasn't, a big PR machine unless you were Edith Head, costume designers were considered just like the person who, you go to wardrobe, you get your costume. Like, what's the big deal? Like, there was no understanding of the process of it. I think because it was, costume designers are often women, I we could do a whole other webinar on that. I think the, inherent sexism in the industry had a lot to do with that. But I think in terms of Ruth, I think this also combined with her own humility, with her own very real humility. I think that, interestingly, as Melissa just played this clip, I was thinking about how that clip really reflected her humility, where you see when Ruth is answering those questions, and this is very typical in any kind of a public situation, she was never talking about herself. She was not, well, I this and I this, and, it was my idea too. And she didn't have, she didn't have that.
Mm.
And even in this clip that we just saw, you can see where she got excited, where she kind of lit up, was when she was talking about the work and the very specific things about the work. Aging Patrick Swayze's jeans, or, this kind of thing. Robert De Niro never wanting to take that shirt off. Things having to do with the work. And even when you see Ruth in front of the camera, you can see she's kind of shy and diffident, but confident when she's engaging with the actors. And I think that tells the whole story right there. She just didn't have the kind of big ego. And, it interested me to hear Melissa talk about how, Ruth was on the Paramount lot doing in Hollywood, doing this huge movie, and yet got really excited when she saw when she saw Edith Head. It would never have computed that she was also an Edith Head in her own way, and I had a similar experience in New York walking down a street in the East 60s with her one day when she kind of grabbed my hand. There was an older woman walking, a very dramatic looking older woman walking ahead of us. And Ruth grabbed my hand and said, "Oh my God, it's Irene Sheriff," who was a legendary Broadway and a little bit of film costume designer. So, she herself could be starstruck, even though she was already a legend, you know.
Yeah, wow. That is amazing. So you worked with her mostly in New York, Susan, or?
Yeah, we went on location a couple of times. There was a TV movie in Chicago. There was the out of town tryout for the Broadway production of Death of a Salesman, also in Chicago. So we were on location in Chicago a couple of times, but pretty much mostly in New York. Yeah.
Mhm. So, Melissa, did your mother bring home the work, or was there like a separation between private life and work life?
Um, no, there was not necessarily a separation. I mean, I remember when I was really young, my sister, so we had two phone lines, landlines. One was the private home line and the other was the work line. I can still know those phone numbers. But so my sister and I would have the worst fights when we would be at home doing something with our mother when her attention was with us, and then that work line would ring and she would like go and be talking to someone about work, and we would, it wasn't thought out, but we would just start immediately fighting so as to make all this noise so that she couldn't have her work call. She did, when we were growing up and we lived in a brownstone, she had in the attic a skylit attic where she had her desk and she would sketch and do her work there. But mostly, the thing that uh, affected us, I mean, there were two things. I remember the first time I was in a limousine, it was so exciting. And it was, we got a ride home from Taxi Driver. And, for me, it was really exciting, but it was also really troubling because I didn't feel I could tell my friends in school, oh, I got a ride in a limo, because they would say, how did you get a ride in a limo? And I'd have to say, De Niro gave us a ride home. And then it would be like I was bragging about knowing a movie star. So that was kind of funny. But what happened regularly was that I would, give away, I would put clothes that I no longer liked or didn't want to wear in a bag that I thought was going to Goodwill. And then I would see said item of clothing in a film. So like in Parenthood, I think it's Martha Plimpton is wearing an Indian print wrap skirt that I thought had gone away. And then also my sister and I, knew very early on how to walk onto a movie set. But it wasn't, when we were little, it wasn't so exciting. It was sitting somewhere waiting for our mother to pay attention to us. And, because on films, they do the same thing again and again. And as, when I started being interested in filmmaking myself, I wished that I had taken advantage of actually paying attention to the directors and to what was going on, because she worked with some amazing directors that I could have been watching. Another thing is, if you watch Taxi Driver, there is a scene where De Niro is speaking at a rally in Cadman Plaza in Brooklyn. I don't think it says it's Cadman Plaza. I know it's Cadman Plaza, but and the Secret Service notice him, and he has to run away. There are two little girls with long brown hair and tie-dye T-shirts and like bell-bottom jeans, holding hands, walking back and forth, and that is myself and my sister. You can freeze the frame and see us for a very little moment. And Emily was also in, and actually that led to a difficult issue because whoever was doing payroll or so, at that time you weren't given a social security number when you were born. So I didn't have a social security number yet. And someone made one up to get me paid. And so for some years I had two social security numbers, and I kept getting these letters saying, which one is yours? So it was very strange. But my sister was in Annie Hall in the bumper cars in Coney Island, but it got cut. She was sad about that. And she still gets residuals. I think it was $7 last year from Superman, which again, she's a little girl whose cat gets stuck in a tree, and Superman on the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, and Superman swoops down, but it started raining and they couldn't finish the shot. And so they rebuilt the set a year later when they were shooting in London. But by then she was acting at the Long Wharf and she couldn't go to London. So she's not in it, but her $7 royalty checks continue.
That is amazing. Yeah, I'm amazed to learn or to think about, how much work went into communication, went into preparing the clothes, that, this whole profession must have changed completely with, already with the iPhones or with the mobile phones, right? And with that you can be reached at any time, but also in terms of clothes, I'm amazed at how she paid attention to little details, like this image of her having 10 jeans of the same make and same size being aged, and I find that just absolutely amazing. And I'm wondering, Susan, do you have like a specific situation in mind that where she is represented the most typical for you, or that has a meaning for you?
I would like to share a story regarding aging of costumes to your, that you said that kind of stood out for you. First of all, that kind of very careful costume aging often is outsourced to an artisan who specializes in that. But Ruth was such an artist herself, and any of us who have theater backgrounds originally also, you know, like to do this kind of work ourselves, to age the costumes ourselves. And I was assisting Ruth on a movie that I wish could come back. It was a TV movie called Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number, and it was based on the horrific experiences of Jacobo Timmerman, who was a Jewish Argentinian newspaper editor in Buenos Aires in the 19 or in the late 60s, early 70s, I think it was. I'm not exactly sure. I don't exactly recall the specific time frame, but in that general area when, there was a fascistic autocratic regime and people were being disappeared in the middle of the night, and there were mass graves in Argentina, and there were thousands of people who were disappeared, and he bravely told their story and of course was incarcerated and disappeared himself as a result of this. He was played by uh, um, Roy, I'll think of his name in a minute. Anyway, and
Roy Schneider, was it?
Roy Schneider, yes. And his wife was the amazing Liv Ullmann, was played by the amazing Liv Ullmann. Anyway, so a lot of this movie took place in Jacobo Timmerman's jail cell over months of time wearing the exact same costume. So we very carefully orchestrated, how many sets of this costume would there need to be? What were the various stages? So we had like 10 different aged stages and a couple of each, you know, so that it was all very clear. On day one, it was pristine. By day 7, it was this. By day 14, 2 months later, so it was incredibly carefully calibrated. And Ruth and I got to work aging these things ourselves, which we did in Melissa's kitchen, in the in the kitchen of the apartment where Ruth grew up, a little bit in the dining room, where we had, a whole paint set up on their dining room table, and we're dyeing things in their washing machine and had drying racks. I mean, we had a whole little setup there, and over a period of days, we we aged, you know, 20 sets, 30 sets, I don't even remember, and this sort of 10 different stages, so carefully done. And at around that same time, shortly, like towards the end of it, and we left, they were all dried, they were done, they were left in a pile in the kitchen or the dining room. And Ruth had a house guest at the time who was the son of a friend, the young son of a friend of hers, and Ruth had generously opened her home up to her friend's young son. And we had this pile of these Jacobo Timmerman finished costumes. And we were out, we went out to do some fittings or something. We came back to her apartment and her young house guest was there and was like, "Oh, hi. Listen, by the way, I saw you had this pile of laundry, so I just threw it in the washing machine and washed it for you."
Oh, no. Oh.
Seriously. We were like, but this is so Ruth. She looked at him. She took a deep breath and very calmly, with this incredible sense of aplomb, was like, "Yeah, those really didn't need to be washed." But she did not lose it. She just kept as cool as a cucumber, had incredible grace about the situation. And then, he went back into his little room and we were both like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" But, you know, we, we just did it again. It took a few more days, but it was done. But I think, the care with which this process, I think it's just a fun, an illustrative story in the sense that, this incredible care and then life happening, and just blowing up, what had been planned, and recovery. and recovery with grace. And I think, that tells you about Ruth.
Yeah. And a question that is being asked here is goes into the same direction, I would think. How did she react when the actor and her design did not see eye to eye? Were there any experiences of overcoming conflict?
That's another great question. That's a really good question. And yes, of course there were, you know, because that's inevitable. And not all actors are come from the same place and come from the same kind of process in their work. So, an actor who had a very like methody kind of process would find working with Ruth a very rich experience. A person who just cared about, whether, you know, does this dress make my butt look big, but my fans expect this, there was an adjustment. And Ruth certainly was capable of making that adjustment. But I wouldn't say that for her, that was really where the joy came in her work. But, consummate professional, and that was that. One really funny example of that kind of thing, I think it was on a movie where there was a big TV star in a leading role, and Ruth had designed a very nice classic, like little black cocktail dress. And she knew, the actress knew what this dress was because, of course, she had seen the sketch ahead of time. And yet she came to the fitting and was just crestfallen because it wasn't a red dress, because she expected it to be a red dress. There was no reason for her to have expected it, but it was just what she wanted and hadn't expressed. So she got the actor got very petulant, and no, this needs to be a red dress. I thought this was going to be a red dress. Why isn't it a red dress? It needs to be a red dress. And got the director involved, who was a wonderful director. And, it was all very diplomatically handled. And a red dress was designed, a red dress was swatched, and a red dress was built. Came time for this fitting of the red dress. The same actress came into the fitting, looked at the dress, and again seemed very disappointed, which was confusing. And Ruth said, "You look, disturbed. This is a red dress. This is what we talked about. Is something wrong?" To which the actress said, "Well, I know I said a red dress, but I didn't actually mean a red dress. I meant it just had to have the feeling of a red dress." What in the world does that mean? And again, Ruth stayed cool as a cucumber. Director came in to see the dress and, of course, was just like, "That's a wonderful dress. So I love that dress. You should wear that dress. Oh, yes. Wow, great to have a red dress." I mean, he was a very sophisticated director, and, that was that. But it was just such a funny kind of a story. I didn't mean a red dress. I meant it just had to feel like a red dress. So, there were those moments too.
Yeah. But it seems like she was always about people first, right? Like really listening and trying to read what they wanted, what they expected, and trying not to be too aggressive about her ideas, putting her ideas on anyone.
That's a really interesting point, because while she was, you know, truly collaborative, she also, brought a hell of a lot to the table. So she was not servile. She really, it was about the actual costumes, and so she really had an incredible amount of creativity, vision, integrity, about the work itself, and was able to communicate that really successfully, which, part of her magic.
Mm-hmm. So did Ruth ever talk about how she got interested in film during her year of wartime in Britain or later? I don't know whether it's a question for Melissa or for Susan. Who can
I
answer?
think that's a Melissa question.
So, I mean, I know that she first became, I mean, I know that she could always draw. I mean, from very little, she was a talented artist. She did watercolors, she did crayons. I have some, childhood drawings of hers. In England, she did become enamored of films. That was her first exposure to the movies, and she fell in love with that. And she was like she would draw flowers and things for girls in her school in their lab classes where they were dissecting things, and then they would help her with her maths homework. And then she maybe thought of being a painter. She studied with Hans Hofmann in New York, and she also modeled for Hans Hofmann's classes. She had also another name. She took the name Andrea when she was a young painter and artist in New York. And so there were people later in life who knew her as Andrea rather than Ruth. But, then, she studied at Cooper Union, and then she fell in with Rose Bogdanoff, who became her mentor. And I think, again, it was the apocryphal story that I heard was that she had really wanted to be a set designer, but the union test was cheaper, and she fell into costume design and started doing it for dance and opera. And I think really fell in love with that and the storytelling possibilities of it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Were her drawings ever exhibited? Where can people find them, or can you give us?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they haven't been exhibited. We're going to have prints of some of the film sketches exhibited at the event on March 12th, and we're working on starting to develop an exhibit that could be an actual exhibit, not just for one night. Her film sketches, her film marked scripts, which as Susan knows, like production scripts are an amazing thing, filled with Polaroids and all sorts of information. Her film archives are at it used to be called the Margaret Herrick Library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in LA. They're sort of rebranding everything into just being called Academy Collection or so, but they're at the Academy Library, and you can see low resolution images of many things if you search their collection. And then her theater sketches are at the Billy Rose collection of the New York Public Library.
Mm-hmm. And so that's good to know that they will be exhibited and that we'll be able to see them. That's really exciting. Another question for you, Melissa. How did your mother's example influence the careers that you and your sister have pursued?
So, I mean, I think it's that we grew up in New York, and we grew up. Our father had an art bookstore, and we grew up in sort of this world of film and theater and arts. And my sister became a child actress, and so she was definitely influenced. I I did not like being on sets, but it was a world that I knew.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it wasn't until so then I started working in documentary film, which is film. So I had a background in film. I had friends who film was a whole alien world. I knew it like there were dynasties. There were mostly male dynasties, but father and sons who were camera, and then fathers and some daughters who were props or who were sound. So I knew film as a world where people could work. It was magical, but it wasn't alien. So I had that familiarity, but I didn't, but I went into documentary film, which is a whole different kettle of money and all sorts of other things from narrative feature films. But having that background definitely, I think, made us more comfortable in any kind of artistic work.
Mm-hmm. that
And
makes
in living and working freelance, which is, again, another super stressful choice to make.
freelance and your father self-employed. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
like the whole gamut of,
I see there's a question about Annie Hall, and I want Susan to answer that because I think that is something that really needs to be addressed.
Okay, it's Carol is asking whether Ruth was given any prompts in her design of Annie Hall's clothes, or was it entirely her concept? What that character wore started an entire new women's clothing style.
Yeah,
So,
that's another great question. That was way before I knew Ruth, so I wasn't, I can't give on the scene reporting on that. But the insight I can provide is that, as I've kind of explained, she worked very collaboratively with actors and they discovered characters together. And I would say that I can imagine that Ruth worked that it was an evolution, that it wasn't that I wouldn't imagine that Ruth said, this is what it is,
mhm,
just put it on, you know, nor can I imagine that she didn't have tremendous impact and insight into what those clothes were and a really decisive hand in what they were. So I think, in a way, Annie Hall's an interesting example because, unbeknownst to anybody, of course, that look blew up. It was just, an idea whose time had come, an incredibly popular movie, and a winning actress, all the elements, and this exploded. Well, in those situations, there's no shortage of people who want to take credit
mhm,
for that. And I think, as Melissa and I have explained, Ruth wasn't really a self-promoter in any way. And so I think this kind of unrealistic sense that somehow it was only all from the actor. Like the act, you might think if you read certain things that the actor just kind of brought a few things in from home and that was the Annie Hall look. Or you might think that Ralph Lauren, because one or two items were used that were from his menswear collection, that Ralph Lauren designed the movie. Or you might think that it was Woody who came up with, there were no shortage of people to claim credit for this
mhm,
look. The person who you most don't hear about, of course, in the context of that particular costume, is Ruth. And having been in so many fittings with her, I cannot imagine a situation where she was not incredibly decisive and contributing and creative about what that look was.
mhm. Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense after everything we heard about her.
And
Um,
can I
yeah.
just add, I just want to add as a teenager who was there but not paying the most attention, still, I know that she looked at the script, she broke down the script, she knew that yes, the character of Annie Hall was based on Diane Keaton. It was written for her, but she saw it as a character and she was trying to figure out, working with Diane Keaton, of course, how that character would dress. And also how I remember her talking about how it evolved, like how you look at the change in the costumes as the character evolved. So that there was a through line through that developed through that film as well.
Mhm.
Right, and that's the visual storytelling. That's the visual storytelling part. As I looked at a little clip that Melissa had sent me yesterday, and Ruth told an anecdote about after Annie Hall, she had some phone messages from somebody at the New York Times that she totally ignored because the person at the Times was in fact trying to contact her to talk about the Annie Hall look. Ruth did not return those calls because she thought it was just somebody pestering her to renew her subscription. There you go.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, I'm glad that we were able to celebrate her birthday today, commemorate her on her 100th birthday, and take her a little bit out of her, I think we can say now, self-created shadow, right? Self-inflicted shadow by not just, um, leaving the promotion to the actors and the directors and whoever had the biggest ego. So thank you so much for being here today and celebrating with us. I have learned a lot about the history of costume making and costume design, and about Ruth Morley. And looking forward to learn more on March 13th. And wish you all the best. Thank you so much, Melissa and Susan, for talking with us.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Rachel, for inviting us. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.